My interest in girls and autism really started probably back in 1999 when I was running a residential boarding house in an independent school where middle-class parents, so kids don't have difficulties, do they? Or that certainly was the belief of senior management at the time. We had no educational psychology support, no clinical psychology support, and we didn't do a particularly good job with 5% of kids who didn't fit the neurotypical category. And I got interested in autism because of one boy who came to me. But when I started learning, and it was a very, very steep learning curve at the time, I knew a lot less about autism even than I do now. But when I looked around in my boarding house of about 85 young people between the ages of 10 and 13, I identified 7 who I thought were at risk of being on the autism spectrum. I'm sorry if at risk sounds a bit negative, but you know what I mean, that I thought might hit the criteria. And there were 3 girls. And I had this gut instinct, this intuition that these girls were just hanging on by their fingertips in some ways. They were struggling to integrate with their peer group. They had certain characteristics like the need for routines and rituals and structure and so on. But at the time I didn't have the confidence. And I think there's an issue, I think back to what was said earlier today about the age at which someone finds out. And particularly with girls who seem very adept at masking some of their difficulties. That there's little signs, and I know from a very close family member, I'm scratching my head and I'm wondering if I'm a bit like Tony Atwood, who recently, even in the last few days, came out and said, well, I missed my son. You know, for 30 years I missed the fact that my son is on the autism spectrum. And similarly, a girl who only crosses a pavement at certain points, who will only use certain types of cutlery, who will only listen to the television or watch television if it's on a volume setting of 5, 10 or 15, who has quite rigid dietary requirements in terms of becoming a vegan, but suddenly she's a vegan all the way through. And wondering, is this just an aspect of a normal personality, part of this great heterogeneity of human personality, or is there something there that should lead us down the route of saying, perhaps she's on the spectrum? So I wouldn't claim to be an expert at all in girls and ASD. I think there are a lot of questions to be asked. And since becoming independent and working as an independent educational consultant, what I've found is, yes, I'm dealing with a lot of school issues because school seems to be very, very big. Common stories about girls coping in school and teachers saying there's nothing wrong, we don't see any difference. And then parents saying, but hang on, life is hell at home. It's hell for us, it's hell for her. And trying to get some recognition that girls can present very differently in those different domains. But recently I've become involved in issues around gender, and sadly one of my very first clients took their own life earlier this year because of a range of issues, but the confusion around gender identity and this association with autism, which I think is very interesting and needs further exploration. The area that I've been dragged into kicking and screaming, and which will be relevant I think to many in the audience today, is that of statutory services as they were described, looking at families affected by autism, looking at mums with autism, looking at family situations in which a child has autism, and being misjudged and finding very, very tragic. I find it very upsetting because A, I don't get paid for any of the work I'm doing, but B, I'm seeing a huge amount of human misery caused by a lack of understanding of why a child is presenting in a particular way. And the standard approach being, oh, there are attachment issues, or there's neglect, or something happening in the home situation. So I find myself attending children's panels, going to court hearings and so on, and realising that the system just isn't up to speed. It's not a system that understands or is sympathetic to those complex dynamics that may take place within a family. And my gut feeling is that what we need is far more specialised support really early on to prevent situations escalating out of control. So that's my background. I'm a bit of a fraud, I suppose, by being male and supposedly neurotypical, but that's me. the charge today was to, and this is going to be incredibly boring after the wonderful talk we heard this morning. We'll wake you up before lunch, if that helps. But this is really about executive control functions, because many parents will, in the report from the paediatrician or from the CALMS clinician, will receive a diagnosis and will understand that autism is associated with certain weaknesses in cognitive processes, particularly central coherence, theory of mind, and executive functioning. And I don't know how much information is then provided about what we understand by those terms. And there may be a risk of thinking those as being separate boxes, that you've got a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of the other, and that they don't interrelate. But of course they do interrelate. And I think that by gaining an understanding of what they are and how they work together, you can get an understanding of those difficulties that some young people and adults will face, particularly around behaviour. And I'm going to be looking at meltdowns and tantrums and meltdowns a wee bit. We won't have a huge amount of time to do that, but that's one of the sort of areas where I think it can be really, really helpful if you're a practitioner, if you're a school teacher, if you're even at home, understanding perhaps what the meltdown is and understanding ways of managing it. So that's a sort of brief itinerary of what I intend to go through. What are executive control functions? How do they impact on learning, on behaviour, on social interaction and general quality of life? And then we'll do Q&As at the end. And I don't mind if you disagree with anything I say. I apologise in advance for any faux pas. I will use the term autism. I know some people don't like whether it's an autistic disorder or an autistic condition or whatever. I get bogged down with some of the different terminologies, but if I make a mistake, then just let me know. I'm fairly thick-skinned. The big issue, of course, is the problem in generalising, that the autistic population is very heterogeneous. So in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of functioning, in terms of sensory issues, and so on. And, of course, a lot of diagnostic overshadowing. Autism is best perhaps thought of less as a category than a condition that expresses itself dimensionally, and it overlaps with very many other conditions. So the common pattern for me in some of the clients that come to me is that the child has been diagnosed with something else first. And it will often be something like ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, and it's only later on that they get the diagnosis of autism. Sometimes it can work the other way around. But research is demonstrating that if you go to outpatient clinics, even at the Maudsley, where they did a very big study recently, the outpatient clinics for eating disorders, for suicidal ideation, for self-harm, for anxiety, for depression, substance use disorder, when you look at the population, those populations, what comes through are neurodevelopmental disorders, and in particular autism, and in particular attention disorders. And they're missed. So the experts in eating disorders and the experts in anxiety and depression may actually themselves not have the expertise to be able to tease apart some of the other issues which are underlying those presenting difficulties, and in particular autism. So it's also important to look at dynamism through the lifespan, that a girl who has autism age 11 is going to present very differently when she's 16, 17, 18, as was alluded to this morning. And the whole idea of epigenetics. If we're to understand child development, this probably gives us a framework for best understanding how our genetic inheritance and the environment in which we find ourselves and which we put ourselves can interact to lead to the presentations and the genotypes and phenotypes that develop. What we also, I think, can say is there's a lack of research, and we need to know a lot more specifically about girls and the specific difficulties that girls will face as they grow up into becoming young women, becoming perhaps mums and being involved in families, and then also the elderly, because if we think of the current prevalence estimates of 1.5, 1.6%, and we look at the number of elderly who are diagnosed with autism, it's a tiny, tiny number. And there's inevitably going to be confusion around issues such as Alzheimer's and dementia and what are autistic difficulties that are being faced. And you would approach those in different ways. My interest is in particular in the vulnerable, at-risk young people and the looked-after population. And what is very clear from research and from personal experience is that there are kids going into the system who shouldn't be in the system, and the system doesn't serve them particularly well. So 3 cognitive differences associated with this. I've just been through theory of mind differences, central coherence and executive function deficits. Notice the heavy emphasis on the negatives, on the disability, perhaps need to move away from that way of talking and thinking. Francesca Happe talks about autism as being a cognitive style, and I like that. Just a different way of processing the world, making sense of the world, and therefore working with the world or working in the world. And here we go, a very busy slide, too busy. And in fact, I'm only putting that up to demonstrate the complexity. Executive control functions are not domain specific in the brain. So if you think about language, language belongs in certain parts of the brain, or certain part of the brain. Memory, working memory, long-term memory, and so on. The prefrontal cortex involved with organisation and processing, domain specific. Whereas executive functions, I think the best example I could give or allude to is the idea of that computer in your car. If you think of your car as having a cooling system, having a combustion system, and having an electrical system, those three systems have to work together. And it's the computer that does that. The executive control function that's what it really refers to. So it's not referring to specific functions that occur in a particular domain in the brain. It's rather where those functions pull together. And we use them, those of us who are neurotypical probably use them to a very high level without even thinking about them. So for example, on the M8 this morning, queue of traffic, am I going to get here on time? I'm able to think through exactly, I'm able to look at the timing, I'm able to look at alternative strategies if the road is blocked, I'm able to put into perspective the fact, if I'm late, does it really matter? You know, if my routine changes, if that sequence of events isn't going to take place, then I can do something else. And that, of course, means that I can manage my anxiety a lot better than someone who can't do that. Again, one of the themes that I was very pleased came through so strongly this morning is the issue around anxiety, because it's my belief, having worked at local authority level, being called into those crisis situations, that if you go in with an understanding of anxiety, of what autism is in terms of anxiety, you can make a very, very big difference very, very quickly to a young person's experience of school. And it can be around, for example, demands being made to attend assembly. Do you have to go to assembly? Does it really matter if a young person doesn't go to assembly? Does it really matter if they wear slightly different clothing because of the sensory needs? I think that the Durham principle is one that I apply quite a lot. But in terms of executive functions, you can see there that working memory, the ability to hold information and manipulate it and make sense of it, the ability to reflect on one's own behaviours and to inhibit certain responses, the cognitive flexibility to take one particular way of thinking and then to think it through from a different angle, and those lead to these higher order executive functions that we're discussing. I prefer this diagram. I'll give you a minute to have a quick look through it. This is from Tom Brown, and it organises it in a much, what I think is a much more logical way, and it's an easier way. I would prefer to take this into a training session I was doing with teachers than the previous diagram. And so the executive functions: activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action. And in particular, the ability to manipulate those or to organise those in such a way to get a positive outcome. What I think you'll probably find is that, and this description I think is also very apt. Remember, this has nothing to do with intelligence. So if a young person or an adult has difficulties with executive functions, it's not because they don't have intelligence. It will often be because they struggle to pull those intelligences together in such a way that positive outcomes can be achieved. So described as like a disorganised cook, you've got everything there in place. There's nothing wrong with the brain. It's nothing wrong with the brain in terms of intelligence. It's the way that those capacities and abilities are used together. And I think of it, probably my translation is it's cognitive multitasking. Right? So, and it's something, as I say, that we use on a regular basis. There's only probably one person in the room at the moment who is working at a high level of executive functioning, and that's me. Because you're not under pressure. You can sit there, you can absorb. Your mind may be on other matters altogether, and I wouldn't blame you. Maybe you're thinking about lunch, which isn't too far away, what you're going to do this afternoon, what your son or daughter are doing at school, etc. But I'm the one who's got to have almost like a PowerPoint in my head of thinking, as I start a sentence, where is this sentence going to finish? How is it going to lead on to the next one? How is this slide going to lead on to the next slide? I'm trying to read your facial expressions. If I see people yawning at the back, so be warned, then I know that I'm losing you. If you start looking at your watches, then I know also that I'm going to be losing you. So all those processes are taking place. I'm under a lot of pressure, in a sense, which I hope I'm coping with. But you are not. I could easily reverse roles, and I could ask someone in the room to come up and stand on stage. I wonder how many heartbeats have just gone up when I said that. I've just invested in from a tech company in Canada what is a device that is intended at aiming to measure anxiety levels through thermal conductivity on the skin that children can wear or adults can wear, and it links to an app on a phone which shows stress levels. And I'm thinking this could be incredibly useful because, as was pointed out earlier, we don't always know when those stress levels are rising. And wouldn't it be very useful, particularly where we're in a school situation where we're looking at challenging behaviour or difficult behaviours, or for just the health and well-being of the young person themselves, if we can work out how those stress levels are changing throughout the course of a day. And where there's a peak is understanding what does that peak coincide with. For many young people in school, it's break time, or it's lunchtime, or it's getting on the school bus, or it's a transition home, or a transition between lesson or corridors, or whatever. Having that information objective information could be incredibly useful. And it would be very interesting to see how, as I alluded to before, how stress occurring at one part of the day can relate to an event later in the day. Because I think as parents, what comes through to me from discussions I've had is that very often the meltdown that occurs at 7:30 at night is linked to an event that occurred at 11 in the morning. And if you can make those links and make sense of that, then obviously there are things you can put in place to deal with them. So, difficulty organising tasks and identifying what is important. What I find with the young people who are at university level, very, very high functioning at university level, is that they're often, some of their understanding is exposed, particularly the ability to synthesise information and to prioritise. In subjects such as English, for example, or where a lot of the work is narrative, and they'll spend quite a lot of time going into a huge amount of detail about certain aspects of what an essay question is asking, but not getting the bigger picture, and therefore not giving the answers that's required. It's not a lack of intelligence at all. It's the ability to understand what is lying beneath the essay question. And this is an example from a young lady who I know very well, who came to me now she would be about 14 at the time, and she came to me extremely distressed by that question. Now this is a girl who got 8 grade A's at higher. She's got 4 advanced hires, and she's got a first in aeronautical engineering. So she's a bright cookie, but very distressed about that question. Is there can anyone understand that? And she said it is a joke question, isn't it? In the space below, draw a diagram of the apparatus you would use to separate sand from a solution of salt water. How do you get sand out of a solution of salt and water? There is no sand there, so how can you get it out? And of course what the question is actually asking is, in a solution of sand, salt and water, how do you get the sand out? But it's not written like that. And those of us who are neurotypical read the question and make sense of it, even though it's incomplete. And it perhaps exposes one of the issues, I suppose you could call it being over-literal or over-logical, but actually it's just being literal and it's just being logical. That logically, you can't get sand out of a solution of salt and water. So the way we use language, whether it's verbal or written, as neurotypicals, we're very imprecise, but we manage to get away with it because we read meaning into things where the meaning perhaps isn't there. So in terms, Bob's lost the sequence of his thoughts. That's me most mornings, but executive functioning is the ability to shift from task, to prioritise and then shift from task and sustain attention. One of the interesting pieces of information that's come through some of the big data project in America on autism, taking information from ADOS databases, is the fact that underlying a lot of ASD are these attentional deficits that we can sometimes lump together as ADHD, but may not be, may be separate altogether. But attention seems to be in some way impaired, or some way it seems to be different. And when we look at, because one of my other interest areas is ADHD, A lot of people think that the hyperactivity and the impulsivity in that population, those are the key areas that cause the most difficulty. Because you think of that in terms of kids running out of the road and getting knocked down, or making impulsive decisions that cause them huge difficulty. But actually the attention is the problem, because if you're not attending, you're not picking up social skills. If you're not picking up social skills, then you're going to be isolated quite quickly within your group. And that seems to be the case with some of the high-functioning adults, women that I encounter, is that actually the differences between them and their neurotypical colleagues are very subtle. But they're so subtle that they become severe. And it can be laughing too loud at your own jokes. It can be in terms of where you stand in relation to your colleagues. It can be just not picking up on those social cues. And there's an irony, I suppose, that the higher functioning you are, the more difficult life can be. Again, speaking to a couple of parents the other day, one who had a son who was learning impaired and was in residential services and had a very high quality of life. The other parent of a boy who was higher functioning, but not as happy with it, because they had the level of awareness to understand that they were different, and they wanted friendship, but they didn't know how to achieve it. And the most difficult cases that I deal with at school level are those girls who really want to fit in, really want the friendship, but they can't get there, and because their peer group aren't accommodating of them. And that's something that I suspect is something that's familiar to you. So in terms of executive functions, the ability to sustain attention when sustaining attention is needed on the important things, whether it's a conversation you're having with a member of your peer group, or whether it's something that's happening in the classroom. And misses implied meaning in spoken and written word. I think, again, from the presentation this morning, that came through, that there was a missing out of information, therefore much more difficult to fit into a group. Again, the reason why I had become more involved with girls, and specifically with autism, was at local authority level. One of the patterns that I saw was of 12, 13-year-olds at secondary school, so S1, end of S1, S2, who were falling off the edge, with no diagnosis. And they were labelled, they would go through two routes. One was down the guidance route, and it would be challenging behaviour, or it would be non-attendance, or it would be mental health difficulties. And the other route was through support for learning. But what was common to all of those is when you traced back, because that's what fascinated me. These girls went on to get diagnosis of autism, but it was only at the ages of 12 or 13. When you trace back to the primary school, and you called the primary school and said, Jessica, tell me about Jessica, because she was with you about 3 or 4 years ago. They would say, yeah, she was always on the outside of the group. She sometimes played, but she wasn't really proactive in the group. She wasn't very conversational, and you could see those little markers there, and they were subtle, but they were still there. And these were the girls, by the time 12, 13 was coming along, they were experiencing quite considerable difficulties. And it would have been much nicer if we'd have been able to get in and do some work earlier on. Regulating alertness, effort and processing speed. This, I think, again, is what was alluded to this morning in terms of anxiety. And what some of the interventions and supports that you generate yourself, or as were illustrated, are extremely powerful. List making is one of the most powerful things you can do. And I use it myself because I'm more ADHD than ASD. And what I do is I procrastinate. So the bank statement comes through, and I know it's not going to be pleasant, so I don't open it. I put it in a pile. And the next bank statement, and the credit card, and my wife's brilliant. She does things like open bank statements, which is just, no, how does that happen? So she's very organised, and the reason that I'm not in a ditch with a gin bottle at the moment, or in poverty, is because I did the most important thing, which is to marry someone who is organised, and that is the top technique I would use. But list making is powerful, and it's powerful for a number of reasons. One is that this overwhelming sense, because you procrastinate so much and you put things off doing those really, really boring, mundane things you know you need to do, they build up. And you get this overwhelming sense of the things that haven't been done and that need to be done. And when you actually write them down and put them on the list, in a list form, it visualises it in a much more concrete way, and it takes away the vagueness of the undone tasks, and it presents them visually and clearly and concretely. And The real beauty is as you do those tasks, which always take a lot less time than you thought they would, and you tick them off or put a line through them, you get a tremendous positive feedback that you're achieving something and progressing. Now that is important, I think, not just for those of us who are adults facing some of the difficulties we face, but for young people. And I think one of the things I did towards the end of when I was still teaching, was I started teaching neurotypical classes as if they had autism. And I gave them, when they came in at the start of a 2-year course, I gave them the syllabus and the breakdown. And every time we went through a particular topic, we crossed that topic off. And it was amazing. They thought I was the most organised teacher in the world. In fact, the most badly organised teacher in the world. They thought that I was incredibly well organised, because what I was doing was actually recognising that they need to know where they are. They need that structure. And I don't think it's just about autism. I think it's about being a child sometimes, that we need to give them far clearer idea of where we're heading, what that structure is. So, and in terms of processing speed, then this is where it gets difficult. I think one of the best analogies I had was provided to me was by a psychologist who said that for some of these kids, that getting them to write things down is a bit like going back from broadband to dial-up. If you had to do that now, in all the work you do, in all the sort of social media stuff you do, if you, every time you went on the computer, you had to dial up, for those of you who can remember, and think of the frustration of waiting for a page to load. For a lot of our kids, that's the difficulty that they have, that the ideas that are coming into their head disappear quite quickly. They find it mechanically and physically very difficult to get that handwriting down in a way that they would agree is of a satisfactory standard. And it's just an incredible grind, which is where technology can come in. So, completing tasks on time. Difficulties also, as you'll appreciate, in being perfectionist, that you make one mistake on a page, you have to start again. Not ever having a sense of being able to complete anything. And to be honest, in the world, in the academic world, you can never be perfect. You've got to submit work that is never going to be what you want. Sarah's written books. I bet in every book she would go back and think, I could do it different, I could improve it in some way. But actually for a lot of our kids, they find that very, very difficult to do. And so completion and accepting the fact that you're never going to get it perfect is a talent that those of us who don't struggle with take for granted. Managing frustration, modulating emotion. Again, recognising that horrible feeling in the pit of your stomach. What is that? You feel bad. But being able to put a specific label to it, such as anxiety, or perhaps frustration, or perhaps anger, or just feeling detached, whatever those... And I don't think even our vocabulary is adequate as it is to cope with the broad range of emotions that we feel. But if you don't understand and you can't label your own emotions, it becomes very difficult to employ techniques such as cognitive behavioural techniques in order to overcome difficulties. Can't put to the back of my mind. I wonder how often, as Sarah said this morning, the fact that you've made a mistake, everyone else has moved on, but you keep dwelling on it, and you keep going back to it, and you keep wanting to apologise or in some ways right a wrong that's happened 2 weeks ago, 2 years ago, 20 years ago. And then utilising working memory and accessing recall. One of the areas that I think that is very interesting here is, well, two areas around the use of words. One is the ability of applying tags to memory, so that memories can be retrieved more quickly and made sense of and synthesized, which I think is a lot about how we manage our behavior. That those of us who are neurotypical may have a higher level of ability in terms of accessing memory, and the way we access memory may be through the tagging of memories and tagging of emotions. But also, I've lost my train of thought. Words. I'm going to move on because I can't think. Yes, sorry. Private speech. I wrote to Tony Atwood some time ago because when I was developing a model to use in my... Have I run out of time already?
You've got a few minutes left.
Cheapers. Because... Yeah, okay. I was going to look at the crisis cycle and how executive control... And it relates to what I've just been saying. Private speech. Those of us who claim to be neurotypical use private speech a lot, or private speech is there. In other words, private speech is that commentary in your head That's going on and on and on all the time. And it's not always in your own voice. It can sometimes be in someone else's voice. But you've got this continual inner private speech. And kids, you'll see young kids who use it but externalise it. So you'll see a group of kids standing around, let's say, a table with a railway train on a track, and they'll be talking. But they won't be talking to each other so much as talking to themselves. And now I'm going to put the train on the track. And it's not a conversation. It's that speech that then becomes internalised. And that's a resource that we use. So driving on the M8 this morning, I had that commentary in my head saying, it doesn't matter if you're going to be late, etc., etc. The way that I have use executive control functions in terms of behaviour management and behaviour support at school is helping teachers understand the crisis cycle. And I think a crisis cycle is something that you're probably familiar with, where this axis is indicating intensity of emotion or arousal level, and this is a period of time. That period of time can last from a few seconds to several hours, if not days. But generally speaking, at the moment, you are functioning down here with a very relatively low arousal level, unless I was to call your name and ask you to stand up. So you're relatively calm. There'll be times, for example, when you're driving home, when you'll need to use a lot of your brain functions together. You'll need to do that plate spinning or that cognitive multitasking, as we called it. And there's an intensity that you may find up here. And some people in the room, whether you are 10, 11, 12 years old or 30, 40, 50 years old, there will be times when you will get at the stage where you have that, what I would call a meltdown. Not a tantrum, a meltdown. So this is a neurotypical model, and what I describe is situations when, if you're under pressure, at this point here, certain inhibitors will kick in. And those inhibitors, if you're neurotypical, include things like self-awareness, the ability to stand back and look at yourself others might see you, a sense of how you're portraying yourself to others, a sense that if I have a meltdown in Tesco's car park, then it's going to be a bit embarrassing. And those inhibit the escalation of emotion. There we go. As if by magic. When we look at those who enter an unstable state, then this is what principally, this is where I think executive control functions help us understand behaviour. It's really about disorganised thinking. It's about the emotionality that comes that is disorganised because it can't be or isn't being organised. And there is a reduced sense of proportion and perspective. So, for example, if you have a minor accident in Tesco's car park, then those of us who are relatively neurotypical will tend to stand back and say, well, it's only a scratch car. It's not a big thing. It's not a big deal. Yes, my schedule is being disrupted. I'll have to phone the insurance company. And we organise our thinking. That internal dialogue takes place that allows us to deal with it. But if you think of a young child who is expecting a particular set of events and is in some ways thwarted at the beginning of the day, the rest of the day can fall to pieces. So when we start looking, and that's the HPA axis and the stress response, we don't need to go into all the complex chemicals that are taking place, other than to get this sense, and it's really helpful for kids to understand this, that at the same time that you have the red stuff going on, which is the inflamed emotions, the anger, the upset, you've also got a contradictory response, which is what I call the Gaviscon effect from the Gaviscon advert, the hosing down of the indigestion. And those two things take place at the same time. And the beauty of understanding a bit of the chemistry is that we can also understand the psychology. And this is where you can kick in with some of the cognitive behavioural approaches in communicating with children about their behaviours. So if we think, that to me is what the model I would use with what a lot of the young people and perhaps adults who do experience these meltdowns and whatever, that your executive control functions are likely to be less effective. So there is a smaller window of opportunity. Most young people going into school are already at a high state of arousal. It doesn't take a lot to tip them into a more unstable state. And but interestingly, not only is the escalation very rapid, very often the de-escalation is equally as rapid. Whereas for you and I, if I had a meltdown, I would be dwelling on it for hours afterwards, thinking, oh, I'm so embarrassed, why did I say that, why did I do that, etc., etc. But I think that the interesting thing also is post-crisis, what happens next. And I have a lovely example. of a young child where I was called into school because the police were called. He was a 7-year-old boy, and the police were called to primary school. And yeah, I know. But the incident involved him bringing a knife into school. because they were doing craft work, so he brought his own craft knife in. And it turned into a whole horrible set of events with the police being called. But in reading the narrative report, this youngster had been up here and then was calmed down by the janitor and was sitting with the janitor having a chat, at which point the head teacher decided, this is only about 10 minutes after the incident, decided to say, no, why did you bring that knife into school? That was a very bad thing to do. And of course what you then got is a re-escalation. So, yeah, I haven't really done justice to the whole topic of executive control functions. I have run out of time, for which I do apologise. But what I would suggest is that I think it's worth exploring in understanding particularly the way young people, some of the difficulties they face on a daily basis. But I think it also gives us some idea of the techniques, the direct techniques we can use when a child is in crisis, of particular words and phrases and visual symbols that are not to do with pretending that this trigger event hasn't taken place, but more accelerating through the process into a more stable state. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you a question. I mean, it's not just young people, it's
no,
all through the lifetime, isn't it? You know, so what you're talking about is actually learning strategies to understand what the processes are so you can start actually putting things in place to help deal with them.
Yes.
I still need to write this, you know.
I think the techniques we saw this morning, if we got to the end, they would be the same. I survived because of Microsoft Outlook. And the emails and my calendar, and be able to print it out and access it. I was hopeless. I would still be hopeless if I didn't have that sort of support behind. And the term scaffolding I think is really useful, and it's recognising, I think, that in very highly talented people, those who are high functioning in particular, that small supports put in place can mean that these folk can realise their potential. And the reason I say it with authority is because I'm like that. That I function much better with an organised wife, and I would function much better with a secretary or a PA. Take those away, I don't think I'd be standing here just now. I think I'd be in a bit of a mess.